I'll tell you what's a high tariff nation is Canada. Canada charges us 250% for our milk product and other product, and a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Major construction firms across the United States have just issued a rare coordinated warning that the housing market is entering unprecedented instability driven by tightening Canadian softwood lumber supply with no relief in sight. Throughout the year, this is not a sudden export ban. Canada has not announced a dramatic shutdown. Yet builders, developers, and contractors across America are scrambling because the impact is already devastating, and it is about to get exponentially worse. Here is the part Washington does not want to admit. Roughly 30 to 35% of all softwood lumber used in American home building comes from Canada, and Canada has fundamentally restructured how it prices, processes, and distributes that lumber in ways that sidestep tariffs entirely while inflicting maximum economic pressure on the United States. In a typical wood frame house in America, lumber accounts for 20 to 25% of total material costs. Industry estimates are brutally clear. A 10% increase in lumber prices adds between $8,000 and $15,000 to the price of a new home. For buyers already crushed by high interest rates and persistent inflation, that is not a minor inconvenience. That is a structural shock that pushes home ownership permanently out of reach for millions of families. So, here is the central question driving today's analysis. If Canada is not banning lumber exports, why is Washington increasingly panicked about the largest construction cost crisis in decades? Is this simply another chapter in ongoing trade disputes? Or is it something deeper? A fundamental shift in how resources get priced in a global economy reshaped by tariffs, environmental regulations, and supply chain weaponization? The answer reveals a strategy so sophisticated that most American policymakers completely missed it until it was too late. Canada is not acting through dramatic headlines or political theatrics. Canada is acting through structure, and that structural transformation sits at the absolute center of modern trade conflict, exposing vulnerabilities inside the United States that decades of policy mistakes created but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Let us break down exactly how Canada is tightening lumber supply without ever announcing restrictions, because this strategy will define resource conflicts for the next generation. First, tightening through production control. Canada has quietly reduced softwood lumber output by closing or consolidating older, less efficient sawmills across the country. Since the peak year of 2018, national softwood production has fallen by roughly 15 to 20%. In British Columbia alone, more than 10,000 forestry jobs disappeared between 2019 and 2025. This is not a temporary economic cycle or market fluctuation. This is a deliberate reset of capacity designed to permanently reduce the volume of cheap lumber flooding American markets. Fewer mills means less output. Less output means tighter supply. Tighter supply means higher prices. And Canada captures the premium instead of American buyers. Second, tightening through domestic priority. Canadian provinces are increasingly directing available lumber toward domestic housing projects, infrastructure development, and public construction initiatives. Exporting to the United States is no longer treated as the default option. When supply gets constrained, American buyers move to the back of the line not because of explicit tariffs or regulatory barriers, but because of policy choice. Canadian governments decided their own citizens, their own builders, and their own economy deserve first access to Canadian resources. And that fundamental shift in priority changes everything about North American supply chains. Third, tightening through value-added processing. Canada is exporting dramatically less raw lumber and significantly more engineered wood products like cross, laminated timber-glued laminated beams, and advanced structural panels. The result is higher export value, but lower physical volume for American construction. This means fewer affordable boards available at any price. Canada captures more revenue per tree by processing domestically rather than shipping raw logs south, keeping jobs, wages, and economic value inside Canada, while American builders scramble for materials. Fourth, tightening through environmental standards. New carbon tracking requirements and sustainability certifications raise compliance costs across the industry. American buyers can still technically purchase Canadian lumber, but it is more expensive and less abundant than before. This transforms environmental policy into an indirect trade lever, one that bypasses traditional tariff frameworks entirely while achieving the same economic outcome of reducing American access to cheap inputs. Fifth, tightening through logistics prioritization. Railways and ports now prioritize energy shipments, mineral exports, and critical materials over lumber. Lumber shipments face deliberate delays, heightened uncertainty, and rising transport costs. Another invisible squeeze that compounds every other pressure point. This is not a ban. This is a structural choke point carefully constructed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, making it nearly impossible for the United States to counteract through traditional trade policy responses. The impact on American construction is catastrophic and accelerating. When lumber prices spike, builders do not simply absorb the costs. They add risk premiums on top of material increases. Even modest supply tightening forces contractors to price defensively, protecting themselves against future volatility. As lumber costs climb, new home prices rise faster than wages, deepening the affordability crisis and feeding inflation throughout the economy. This is exactly how a resource issue transforms into a political crisis that threatens elections. But the damage extends far beyond just material costs. Less predictable lumber supply creates a construction timeline crisis where projects face constant delays. A single month of delay can raise total construction costs by 5 to 7% due to financing charges, labor retention expenses, and equipment rental fees. In an environment already strained by trade tensions, delays magnify losses instead of stabilizing markets. Then comes the market expectations crisis, where fear itself drives destructive behavior. Developers, distributors, and wholesalers rush to secure supply early, creating hoarding, speculative buying, and artificial shortages. Prices rise not only because lumber is genuinely tighter, but because markets expect it to be tighter. That feedback loop destabilizes pricing across the entire economy. Finally, there is the political and social crisis that Washington fears most. Housing is no longer just an economic issue in America. It is a voter issue that determines elections. Rising home prices push younger families permanently out of ownership, raise rents across cities, and increase housing's weight inside consumer inflation calculations. As inflation stays elevated, interest rates remain higher for longer, creating another indirect cost spiral, directly traceable to trade policy failures and resource dependency. But here is what most analysis completely misses. Canada actually gains from this entire restructuring by shifting away from raw lumber exports toward processed wood products. Canada captures more value per tree while creating higher-skilled, better-paid jobs. Instead of exporting low-margin inputs to America, Canada sells finished or semi-finished products with stronger pricing power. That is a direct upgrade in economic positioning. By embedding carbon tracking, sustainability, certification, and traceability requirements, Canada positions itself as a rule setter rather than a price taker in global markets. In a trade war era where tariffs are blunt instruments, standards become the sharper, more effective tool. Canada is also protecting long-term resources by treating forests as strategic assets rather than inventory to be cleared. Slower harvesting supports ecological stability and supply predictability over decades, stabilizing pricing and strengthening Canada's credibility as a reliable long-term supplier. And by diversifying away from American dependence, Canada reduces political pressure from Washington while building relationships with European and Asian buyers willing to meet Canadian standards and pay Canadian prices. So, what is Canada really trying to prove? This moment is not just about lumber. It is about identity leverage and long-term positioning in a global economy being reshaped by trade conflict. Canada is sending three unmistakable messages. First, to Canadians themselves, natural resources will no longer be sold at discount prices just to satisfy American demand. The goal is fewer exports but better jobs, higher wages, and more value kept at home. Second, to the United States, Canada is no longer an unconditional safety valve for American consumption. Trade relations are now reciprocal, not automatic. Proximity does not equal dependency anymore. Third, to the world,